I'd like to welcome you all this morning to today's program with Dr. James Mackay, presented by Searchlight Seminars. And Dr. Mackay, I'd like to welcome you and tell you what a pleasure it is for us to have you here. And I'd like to know how you would like to begin this morning.
I would, I'd like to, before I begin talking much, just spend a few minutes quietly with you. And then I would like to review some of the principles which seem to me terribly important if, if one is to have a place to put an understanding of sexual energy within a spiritual context. That review then would involve a repetition of some of the basic principles which we discussed in the last two seminars. That will allow me to recast some of the central notions and may help people who might have joined us for the first time in this session to have some anchor points to follow the discussion. That review then will, I think, be followed by some specific issues, some which I will raise and some which Pascal has in questions from the last seminar. Is that okay? Then, if you would just join me in a few minutes of quiet, that would be a great help to me. Thank you. The comments that I will make today are grossly inappropriate for people who do not have a basic spiritual orientation. Because sexuality is to be conceived of very differently according to one's particular responsibilities and place in the world. For those who do not have a deep, almost overriding obsession with God, the comments which I have to make are quite inappropriate. The most of what is written in the literature or taught in classes on sexuality is not either written or taught or meant to achieve the kind of understanding which I will attempt to move towards today. And it is quite appropriate that, that it be conceived of very differently. Sexuality, from the perspective of people with a basic spiritual interest, will work very differently, extremely differently in their lives than will be the case of people who do not have that kind of an obsession. So Another way of saying it is that people who, to use Mayor Baba's vocabulary for a moment, people who are being softened up for the unwinding process, or people who have begun in any one lifetime that process. The role of sexuality is entirely different from the way it works and the way it is spoken about, and the principles are explicated in psychological textbooks. I have written such textbooks, and I have edited such textbooks, and um, so that I have that kind of background, I would never speak the way I intend to speak today with professional colleagues, even those professional colleagues who I consider wise and specialists in the roles in sexuality, sexual therapeutics, and learning related to gender, sexual identification, and roles. Not only then is the role of sexual energy differently patterned in the living reality of the lives of spiritual aspirants than among other people, but the role of sexuality and the energy and power itself changes and is modified from one historical epoch to another. There are periods when sexuality does not become a major kind of subject matter for spiritual students. For some, it always is. But there are historical periods when it is not the major issue that in some ways it becomes today. The reason for that has to do with the fact that the climate of divine energy on the earth changes. It changes from one historical period to another. Science and people with a bent towards orderly understanding of the world assume always that sexuality, as well as certain kinds of power and force, as well as certain kinds of love, are always and everywhere the same on earth. That is not true. The climate of living energy on the earth differs dramatically from one historical epoch to another. When there are periods which involve a major spiritual boost, major spiritual vibrancy, then there may be also linked with that tremendous sexual energy released. I say there may be. That is not always the case. But in this historical epoch, that is the case, which is why I'm speaking of it. Sexual energy is, of course, simply divine energy. It is, in some ways, the most precious of the separately identifiable bands of divine energy. It is the most precious because it is that band of energy which seeks the propagation and the reproduction of all living forms on earth. And it is also that band of energy which, having achieved that purpose, pushes and forces consciousness and human learning to new levels of propagation, to new levels of understanding, and then again, once one has understood, once one has achieved a kind of competence in a new realm, one honors that achievement and that competence by again propagating that realm and then moving on. When I say propagation, I mean there is a central principle in life. And it is the central principle that God adores all of it. He does not despise his creation, nor critically evaluate the patterns of divine learning by which it progresses. So there is no progress by taking the attitude that major parts of God's creation are reprehensible and miserable. And if God had fully understood, he would have done it differently. To have that view, of course, simply means that you have not yet understood the way it is to be done, and you have not understood the learning involved in it. Because when you do, you will no longer find it reprehensible. You will no longer oppose it. You will integrate it and understand it, and with joy in that understanding, you will propagate it. You will regenerate it because you will know how crucial it is to the total process. The process of propagation and generation, the reproduction uh, of divine forms, is in its most broad understanding sexuality. It seems an unfortunate prerequisite of the sharply focal learning of most human beings that in order for them to value something, they must devalue what seems to them might be opposed to it. They must sharply etch their understanding in clearly defined little pie-shaped boundaries that make them glorify their piece of pie and assume that the other pieces which lie outside their boundaries must be deficient. That, of course, is non-spiritual learning. that is religious learning, that is dualistic learning, that is the kind of learning, the kind of approach, and the kind of orientation which gives science a good name. Because that kind of articulation, that kind of clarity of thought, that kind of sharply etched boundaries, that kind of thinking is much current at this stage of creation, and it is very useful. We live within such boundaries at all times. Those boundaries of thought that other people share and think. The, we, we must deal with them all day long, every day. But they are provisional and temporary. When we must master them, but when we have mastered them, we then honor them so that we don't go around telling other people, oh, you are stupid. The, your boundaries are too sharp. If you really understood it, you would see how what you're saying is really can be said 10 other ways and mean 10 other things, if only you understood. Of course, one doesn't do that because one knows how useful those boundaries are, how helpful they are to consolidate pieces and kinds of learning and knowing and directions in life. And so when one honors them with others, one will even help propagate them with others, if that must be, but not with himself. With himself, he is an idiot to do that. With himself, if his bounded learning has achieved any of its full processes, the boundaries will dissolve, and he will gradually see not this piece and that piece and the other piece of the pie, but the total rounded circumference of it, the extension of it from a central pole. And it's and an understanding of it from any perspective on its circumference. That kind of learning and that kind of knowing is a kind of knowing and learning which is basic, absolutely fundamental to any kind of spiritual understanding. That is what spiritual understanding is. The It therefore brings with it a recognition of the importance of the pieces of pie, a recognition of the importance of learning each little piece, and being able to break the pie in any way, the importance of dealing with people according to the piece of pie in which they live. But for oneself and for one's spiritual companions, it means gradually learning that those pieces are illusory, cut off because one has to learn to eat the pie piece by piece and, uh, and digest it piece by piece. But when one has learned any whole set of knowing, then the dualistic fragmented, oppositional kind of learning begins to dissolve. It is that dissolving of patterns of learning of that kind which is called spiritual unfolding or spiritual learning. And it is deeply personal. You can't go around telling other people how to do it. The laws by which people learn one piece of pie and then another, and then they cut the pie differently in concentric circles from the beginning to the outer edge. The laws by which will ensure that you know that whole pie until you're sick of it are called the laws of karma. And in each lifetime, you learn this little piece and that little piece and the other little piece. And you'll learn, and you will learn gradually many, many, many pies. And you will also learn them simultaneously and not realize that you are at work in any one life on about 7 stacks of pies. And that as your learning seem focused with one stack, also there's something taking place that you don't know about with the pies over your head. And that you'll learn that you'll eat your way from one side of the pie to the other, piece by piece by piece. And you'll do that with all those pies. And you'll eat those pies from left to right. Your learning in the first half of creation involves your eating from left to right. When people come to my house, I won't even let them pass the salt and pepper in that direction. If anyone starts filling the water glasses and they start going from left to right, I am liable to throw something at them. I have no patience for that. I have my idiosyncrasies. They are legion. The reason that I say that is that you should understand there are divine principles, laws, and forces at work in the patterning of all divine learning. And that the reason you should understand that is that Meher Baba said at this time he would like some kinds of knowing which in most epics of the past has been reserved only for spiritual students and only for those who already know the processes because they have to deal with them in their own bodies and consciousness. Meher Baba said, no, I want it changed this time. It will hasten things. If people have in their lower minds some of the articulated principles that will later govern the reality of their return to me. So he said, some of that I want said, and I'm going to say some of it myself. And, and I'm going to tell people to read it, whether they understand it or not. And I'm going to tell them to read it 10 times, even if they don't understand it. Because there is a part of them that knows it. And if they read it 10 times, that will quicken those underparts. And he said, I want things quickened now for a change. Boy, are they quickened. But you should understand then that even the currents of your consciousness and the way in which your consciousness gathers and consolidates the matter of thought and feeling in the creation of its nets, which are then attached and become a permanent part of your consciousness. That even the direction by which you capture and hold thought and feeling in personal learning in those nets of consciousness is determined by law. The way in which one life leads to another, one excess of learning leads to another excess. Creation and learning is excessive. It's extreme. And it goes from one extreme to another. Mayor Baba talked about that. He said if it looks like it's getting too even, the fulcrum will lose its balance. Boom! Because there is no learning that is easy and neutral and done with calm, dispassionate equanimity. There are many lives so lived. There are many schools of philosophy which hold such a pattern as a model, but there is little learning in any such life, at least not on the surface. Meher Baba said, I want people driven half mad. I mean, people, now don't quote me. Meher Baba said, people must care. They have to care about what they're doing. And if they're going to accomplish any kind of spiritual learning, they've got to risk things. And they have got to risk a lot. They've got to risk everything. And then what do they have to risk it? With absolutely no guarantee. He said, those are the ones I want. The others go away. Now, when he said go away, of course he'd be over there to get them. He would say, these are also the ones I want. These are mine. These, all these are mine. But what he asked for people who could hear the message was, if you are going to pursue, or if you feel quickening within you the direction which will take you in pursuit of me, then give it everything. Give it all. Give it all you can. Then he said, it is a privilege to be able to do it. It is a great privilege to be able to do it. People think it's a terrible hardship. They think if they, oh dear, well, we're not going to get into that. But, uh, but you have to then understand that the laws of initial learning in this system of creation are lawful. The patterns by which one gradually winds, weaves, threads, catches experience in those threads, attaches the whole of that experience to membranes which become his consciousness. That process of winding is lawful and is called, and those processes then are familiar as the laws of karma, and they go from left to right. Now, when you are being softened up for the return home, you are on the edges of the pie crust. You've eaten your way, piece by piece, from the center to the periphery. Then you've gone back to the center and then gone to the periphery. And you have done that left to right. You're sitting out there on the periphery. You have done all that, but you don't know it. You are a peripheral being. You are very edgy. You are supposed to be. The direction of currents in your consciousness now change. They don't take you away, they bring you back. They go from right to left. They go counterclockwise. Some people would think counterclockwise was backwards. And so spiritual principles often seem nonsensical. Obviously, they don't take one ahead. They take one back. So they do not any longer have use of those little patterns of articulated thought and life and being that led you away, that gave you reasons for it, and that expanded sequential dimensions of learning about life. Now you go back. And do you know when you are ready to go back, those currents change and they pull. They pull because of the total fullness of your experience, and they pull you the other way. It's a tug of war, but that is what unwinding is. And spiritual principles are relevant. They are only relevant for people caught in that very backward process. In that very backward and therefore then very basic process, you should understand there are not a lot of people there. And on your way back, the currents that direct you will bring you in opposition to a lot of people who are on their way to the edge. They'll know you're an idiot. Usually it is not a help for them to know that. Since you have already covered the terrain that they have covered, it is your responsibility to speed them on their way, to honor where they are going. Not to fight them and get them turned around. It's by divine law they cannot turn around. They will be destroyed if they do. But you can. You can. You can go back. Having been, you can go back, or what would it be? Go ahead? It gets very confusing. And it is especially confusing because the great migration is on its way to the edge. But God needs people who are coming back. And He has to pull them. Because, curiously enough, they are connected to those going that way. And parts of their being are also connected to people going that way. So they get tugged. I'd like now to speak for a moment about that process of tug and the part of you on your backward homeward journey that would take you again back to the edge. Because that part of you is called your ego. There are a few comments about egos which I would like to make, again, by way of review. People think, oh, I'm going to conquer my ego and never have that little crumb around here again. But do you know, that is a battle which is fought in every lifetime. And you're not going to get rid of it. You're just going to get good at dissolving this kind of an ego, and then that kind of an ego, and then another kind of an ego. Because the ego is simply the formation of temporary sanskaras, which you are to clean up as a first step in that lifetime. The process is then, what do you mean clean up? I'm going to clean up the world with my ego. Mm-mm. You've got the referent of my wrong. You can only do your part in cleaning up the world by really cleaning your own ego. And when you do that, it dissolves. So having gained this tremendous amount of experience in living that has taken you to the edge, the process by which you make your way home is to use all of the energy in all of the learning, in all of the millions of lives you have lived, you have captured living energy in each of those lives. You have bounded it in a little piece of pie. Now of this dimension, now of that dimension, now of the other dimension. You have learned it against for this set of principles, with this set of emotions, with this set of feelings. And you have done it all gloriously and sinfully and beautifully and ugly. You've done it every way. If you haven't done it every way, you won't be on the edge. So, and if you're not on the edge, you cannot be obsessed with a return to God. You can pretend it if it's socially correct. Sometimes, curiously enough, it's correct. It's fashionable to be in with God. So, what must you do with all of that experience you have gathered in all all that sanskaric tissue in all those threads? You gathered it all. So now, in each lifetime, a tiny little bit of it, a mixed batch of it, of that experience, of those threads of that knowing, is cast into the structure of your ego for that life. That's your top layer of sanskaras. And it is from the past. It's entirely from the past. You come into life, then into a spiritual life, with a whole set of sanskaras that you will, a whole set of experience that is already gelled, that will incline you certain ways. And that forms the structure of your ego. And then, during that life, and you know, if it's a spiritual life, it's got to be pretty powerful. That means that spiritual aspirants, rather than having pale gray, sweet, radiant, ephemeral egos, tend to have pretty tough and vibrant ones. They should. They should. Because if it's vibrant and tough, there's and full of energy of life, then when that energy of life is released and given divine direction, it can carry them and overcome the friction they will meet as they come back. Especially if you're on the edge. The force of coming back is not as strong as you get closer to the center. And you need dreadful egos, deeply colored sanskaras, forceful natures to carry and release the energy that in that lifetime, through the process of living and honoring spiritual principles will be released, will be released. It is for that reason that Meher Baba said, I want strong people. Take your colorless ones elsewhere. Bring me the strong ones. Now, strong doesn't have to show on the outside. Often, if strong shows on the outside, it ain't so strong. Often, strong masquerades as lilting, light, and flexible. So, that kind of masquerade is one that many of us have seen in our associates. Anyway, one needs a lot of energy stored in the sanskaras of a lifetime to propel him, to give him the energy which can be radiated through the broader lens of his being and total knowing, which is called the higher self or the higher sheaths of consciousness or whatever, and can release that energy. In that release of that energy, then the life unfolds quite literally. You see, during the process on your way to the edge, you're gathering new tissue and tucking it in. You're very tidy. You're tucking in the tissue. On your way back, you're loosening it, throwing it out, and you're letting it go. You're not building tissue anymore. You're releasing the tissue that you have already built. And as you release it, then, which is a physical process and which really happens, as you release it, then the nets of your being, of course, expand. And as they expand, where do they get the energy for expansion? From the deep coloration of the thought, form, and experience of your ego. They get that energy from the energy you bring from past lives. You see, your past lives should have been limited. They're not supposed to be. They're supposed to be pie-like, peace-like, limited. Just as the people you see passing you on their way to their edge are supposed to pursue their focal direction. But you're not to do that anymore. Because now the direction of unfolding in you will pull it all out and will take the strong, forceful kinds of patterns that you from some of your hopefully less distinguished pasts, where you've gathered a lot of energy around mean, dumb goals. Got a lot of power going there. Shoved a lot of people around. Knew you were right. That's the kind of energy that really packs strong tissue in tiny little stone-like forms. And then, when that tissue is radiated, then it gives off nuclear energy. And that nuclear energy, from the total lens of your being, transforms it into the larger subtleties of life, which are your privilege of knowing and your privilege of awakening. But awakening separately and individually in each life. It does not come automatically. It does not come automatically. In each life, you must start with the forceful sanskaras of your ego. And then there must be a denouement. There must be an expansion. There must be a change. There must be an awareness growing. There has to be, and it is as you process that ego, as you process those sanskaras, as they are released. So it doesn't come, each life. A priest once came to me and said, I would die if I thought I would not know God in the same sweetness and fullness as soon as I reincarnated as I do now. I said, well, you'll die then. If you believe in death, you'll die. You'll think you'll die, but you'll never die. And dying won't change it, because you have had many lives in which that was not part of your learning and should not have been part of your conscious learning. And as you come back in a spiritual life, you will draw on that past. And that shouldn't be part. It would be wrong if it were. But now, so it will be. Now the totality of your higher awareness should gradually awaken. But it will gradually awaken in each life. It will not go ablaze and stay ablaze in each incarnation. That would not permit you to do your work. You know, you have work in this creation. You are an instrument of God. And your work is to gather those fragments and forms of knowing, piece by piece, style by style, life by life, relationship by relationship, and to know it, and know its boundaries and its beauties and its limitations. And then when you've done it, to release it. So this question in spiritual literature of getting rid of the ego is something that occurs in every lifetime. And what you can get increasingly good at is the process of self-destruction. And that's what you should get good at. Well, but my therapist says, well, you can't destroy prematurely. You cannot destroy an ego that is to bring you certain kinds of learning in life until it is full and done that. You can't start making your children into little gods. God wouldn't like that. You won't go to heaven. Don't you want to be an angel? Our church history tells us, no. Children must develop, must be strengthened, must be nurtured in the pattern in which they emerge in life. You cannot start destroying a 4.5-year-old's ego. He'll kill you. And he is right. He is right. You can't tell a 9.5-year-old boy, for goodness sakes, don't be hostile and aggressive. He should bop you one. Because those are patterns. Those are patterns of energy which must be integrated, developed, patterned, nurtured, and brought to an integration. It is not your job as a parent to destroy the integration. It is to help it along. And there is a certain kind of way you can destroy its permanent integration. You can undermine the permanency of your child's ego. I can tell you how. You can really undermine it. Just love him. There is nothing so undermining for the permanency of the development of a provisional ego than to discipline your child at the same time you give him extraordinary love. Because as that is done, he will develop in whatever kind of an angel or monster he is to begin to be and learn in that life. But the shell of that will be pretty thin. And the dissolving, if you just love him a lot along the way, you will deeply undermine the permanent solidification of that egoistic form. Now, when the ego, so you have that down. I have people say to me often, oh dear, I have talked for longer than we had scheduled. It is when the ego is dissolved. Do you know what dissolves it? Sexual energy. And do you know what kind of convictions are released and what the permanent orientation then becomes for one through that dissolution, through that process of dissolving? It becomes increasingly divine. So always sexual energy at one or another level is responsible for the dissolving of the boundaries that keep you from God. Because that is the case, do not scorn it. Do not devalue it. And do not think it is opposed to divine processes. It offers the channels of energy which lead to them. And it does so life after life after life. And it does so not just for the gross conscious. It does so for the saints as they move from plane to plane to plane. You may recall, Mir Baba said, sexual energy is not mastered until the sixth plane is fully occupied. By mastery, he meant fully used. So if in the course of the discussion we have today, you discover that you are not absolutely clear about some of the points related to sexuality, you will also have to admit probably you're not on the sixth plane.
We will now break for 10 minutes.